For millennia, while the modern world did not yet exist as a concept, some tribes of the North American continent mastered a type of engineering that few would dare imagine. They built houses inside the earth to survive winters that reached 40 degrees below zero, not for lack of alternative, not out of desperation, but because they understood something about the physics of the natural world. We, with all our artificial comfort, still pretend we don't need to know the wind. On those plains, it wasn't cold. It was a living force capable of killing an adult man in less than an hour. If he stood still, the snow didn't fall. It cut horizontally at speeds that erased any visual reference. Less than 3 meters ahead, the horizon disappeared. The sky and earth merged into a formless white. And in this scenario, entire families survived, not in makeshift tents, not with desperate campfires in the open, but in houses that the earth itself embraced and protected. If this kind of knowledge makes sense to you, wisdom, that withstands time, techniques that modern civilization chose to forget. This is the channel where you find these stories. Each video here is a window into what our ancestors knew and what we traded for convenience. Follow along, because what comes next will change the way you see a simple dirt floor. Common sense says that cold kills those who stay on the ground. The soil freezes, moisture erodes, burying. If it is surrender, the popular image of the North American indigenous in winter is the teepee, that conical leather tent, trembling in the wind of the imposing prairie. Aesthetically, no doubt, romanticized in 19th century paintings, reproduced in films, turned into a symbol. But the narrative that associates all native peoples with this portable structure erases something much more sophisticated. The teepee was a brilliant solution for nomadic peoples who followed the bison herds. But the Mandan, the Hidatsa, and the Arikara, sedentary peoples who inhabited the banks of the Missouri River, in what is now the state of North Dakota, they had a completely different solution. They did not flee from winter. They descended towards it. They dug. They used the earth as an ally, not as an enemy. And the result was a structure that defied any superficial logic about what shelter means. The underground house was not a makeshift burrow. It was a deliberate architectural decision, refined over centuries of careful observation. And the first element of this system begins where no one expects, at 2 meters. Below the surface, the soil temperature below a certain depth remains constant throughout the year. It does not freeze in winter, nor overheat in summer. This phenomenon, now explained by thermal physics with mathematical precision, was empirically known by these peoples. Long before any scientific formula existed, the Earth, from about 1.5 meters, at a depth of 2 meters, it maintains a temperature between 6 and 10 degrees Celsius, regardless of what happens on the surface. In a winter of -40, this difference is not just comfort. It is the line between life and death, the houses of the Mandan and Hidatsa. Known in anthropological literature as earth lodges, earth houses were semicircular structures dug into the ground. The diameter varied between 8 and 15 meters, depending on the family size and the social prestige of the group. The floor was between 0.5 meter and 1 meter below the original ground surface. The external walls were reinforced with a compact layer of earth and clay, and above them an ingenious system of wooden beams. It supported a roof that looked like a gentle hill in the landscape from afar. The Mandan villages blended into the very terrain as if the earth had created those shapes by themselves, but the excavation was only the beginning. What made these houses extraordinarily efficient was the systemic logic that permeated every construction choice. Each element interacted with the next. Nothing was accidental, nothing was decorative. Everything solved a specific problem of the winter of the Great Plains. The central structure consisted of 4 main posts carefully selected, usually of hickory or elm, dense woods resistant to weight and prolonged moisture. These posts, buried at a calculated depth, formed the vertical skeleton. On top of these posts, which would support tons of earth for years or decades, secondary beams radiated toward the peripheral walls, creating a radial frame that distributed weight evenly in all directions. It was a structural solution that modern architects would recognize as load distribution engineering. Above this frame, successive layers of smaller branches were precisely intertwined, creating a dense and interconnected surface. Over this weaving, dry grass and straw were pressed into compact layers. And over all of this, a thick layer of moist earth, sometimes 30 to 50 centimeters thick, was compacted by hand. This formed an almost impermeable surface after drying. This layer of earth became as tough as rustic concrete. The result was thermal insulation, whose efficiency modern engineers try to replicate with fiberglass, expanded polystyrene, and vapor barriers. The heat generated by a modest fire inside the house had extreme difficulty escaping. Thermal losses were minimal. A fire that, in a leather tent, would need to be constantly fed to keep the environment minimally habitable. Inside an earth lodge, that fire retained heat for hours after being completely extinguished. The earth walls not only prevented heat from escaping, they absorbed it during the day and released it slowly at night, functioning as a passive thermal battery. The entrance deserves special attention because it reveals the level of sophistication of the thinking behind these constructions. It was not a simple door. It was an excavated and covered corridor, with a length varying between 3 and 6 meters. It was built at an angle to the main body of the house. This corridor was always oriented eastward, toward the rising sun, and positioned with an intentional curve that was not aesthetic. It was functional because the wind on the Great Plains blows predominantly from the north and northwest during winter. A corridor oriented east with a curve made it physically impossible for the Arctic wind to directly enter and reach the heated interior. The external air would have to travel the entire corridor, turn the curve, lose speed, lose kinetic temperature, and still face a second obstacle. The thick bison hide curtain that sealed the internal opening was a thermal decompression chamber. It was an antechamber that protected the internal microclimate from any external disturbance. Anyone who has lived in regions with severe winter knows that wind is more lethal than static temperature. The wind chill of -40 with strong wind is something the human body processes not as intense cold, but as a biological emergency. The cardiovascular system goes into progressive collapse, and consciousness becomes clouded. The curved corridor of the earth lodges eliminated this factor. Completely inside the house, there was no wind. The temperature was stable. The air was still, and this still air was managed by a ventilation system that deserves to be studied in detail. In the center of the roof of each earth lodge, there was a circular opening called by ethnographers a hole. It was for smoke, but in practice it functioned as much more than that. Directly below it was the central fire at the geometric center of the house. The heat from the fire rose in a column and exited through the opening, creating a continuous and controlled air movement. This upward movement pulled through the entrance corridor a current of fresh air that fed the combustion without letting the cold dominate the environment. It was a passive ventilation system, without any mechanical elements, without any fuel besides the firewood, which kept the indoor air breathable. It regulated humidity, evacuated smoke, and distributed heat uniformly throughout the space. Modern HVAC engineers use identical principles in high-cost sustainable architecture projects. The Mandan did this with wood, earth, and observation. The sleeping platforms were elevated from the ground, arranged around the interior walls, in an arrangement that maximized space usage and thermal protection, separated from the cold ground by wooden structures with airspace below. These platforms received successive layers of bison hide and tanned leather, materials with insulating properties. The modern textile industry took decades to synthetically mimic body heat. During sleep, it was retained with an efficiency that made rest truly restorative. Even when outside the wind carried snow at speeds that would knock down a common tent, the central space around the fire served. As the functional and social heart of the house, it was where cooking was done, where healing and Thanksgiving rituals were performed, where the elders passed down stories and knowledge to the younger generations, where visitors from other villages were received with specific hospitality protocols. During the months when the exterior was uninhabitable, the entire life of a family was concentrated in that space and this one. It was designed to sustain that life with dignity. But the system did not end at the walls. The Mandan and the Hidatsa stored food inside the earth lodge itself, in storage pits, carefully excavated into the house floor. These pits were lined with dry grass and processed birch bark, a naturally antifungal and waterproof material. They were covered with wooden lids covered with earth and functioned as passive conservation chambers below the house floor level. These pits maintained an even more stable temperature than the interior of the dwelling, naturally cool enough to slow decay but never freezing. In them, they stored dried corn in quantities that could feed a family for months, beans, dehydrated squash, smoked bison meat, and pemmican, that dense mixture of processed animal fat, pulverized dried meat, and red fruits that concentrated calories and nutrients. In a compact, stable, high-energy density format, an adult could survive for weeks on modest amounts of pemmican and with intact storage pits. An earth lodge could sustain its family for an entire winter without anyone having to risk their life outside. In search of food, the underground house of the Great Plains peoples was not just a shelter. It was an integrated survival unit. Passive thermal regulation, ventilation, controlled by natural convection, storage of preserved food, protection against wind, moisture, and predators. A system where no solution existed in isolation. Each part depended on the other, and failure of any element would compromise the efficiency of all others. It was systemic thinking applied to survival, developed without universities, without laboratories, with no measuring instruments beyond the human body and observation accumulated over generations. And then came contact with the world that considered itself more advanced, and with it came diseases, for which the native peoples had no built-up immunity. Smallpox decimated the Mandan almost completely. In 1837, a people who had sustained populations of tens of thousands for centuries was reduced to less than 200 souls in a matter of months. Then came forced displacements and federal policies of compulsory assimilation. The prohibition of cultural and spiritual practices and the earth lodges were gradually replaced by wooden houses built according to the European model. They were surface structures, without the thermal intelligence of the ancestral system. They required constant heating with fuels that the peoples now had to buy from outside traders. The exchange did not happen due to demonstrated technical superiority, but through systematic cultural imposition. An architecture that had survived centuries of winters at -40 was abandoned in a few decades, wasn't it? Not because it failed, but because it belonged to a world that colonial policies wanted to erase from collective memory. What the Mandan built. It was not primitivism disguised as ingenuity. It was high-level adaptive engineering, developed over generations of rigorous observation, testing, and continuous refinement. The proof is in the archaeological data. Mandan villages existed in the same locations for consecutive centuries. With stable and healthy populations, structures inadequate to the climate would never allow that. Archaeology tells the story that conventional history books preferred to suppress. Here there is a question that has no simple answer, and that might be the most important that this video can leave. When one civilization eliminates the knowledge of another, whether by force or by the seduction of industrial comfort, who loses more? The people who lose the right to exist. Second, its own wisdom built over millennia of direct relationship with the earth or the whole world that loses access to solutions. With all its technology, it has still not been able to surpass in efficiency, in elegance, in respect for the environment that sustains us. This question has no right side, but it demands that one look at a Mandan Earth Lodge not as a museum relic, not as an anthropological curiosity, but as an answer to a question that winter at -40 asks any human being who dares to take it seriously. What do you really know about surviving, if you want to keep finding the answers that official history preferred to keep silent? The next videos on this channel are waiting for you. Subscribe now because this kind of knowledge doesn't appear just anywhere.